Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but actually majors in on geopolitics. And the reason why I do that is because what I want to do is involve a lot of you listeners into the program. So yes, a lot isn't always about the world of secret intelligence and national security or armed personal intelligence. It's more about the geopolitics of the world. But then that is the world that we in the secret intelligence arena inhabit, that world of geopolitics. That's how actually we function within it, sometimes from within the shadows of that world. Now, today I've got an author on who absolutely fantastically fits this perfectly, because what he's going to do is he's going to explain to you a little known piece of information, or I should say operations, little known operations that went on in and prior to the First World War for the Americans, of the actions of the German state, the German secret intelligence operations against Germany, and the reasons why. The book is fascinating, but I'll let him tell you about that. My guest today, then, without any further ado, is Mr. Bill Mills. Bill, how are you?
I'm great, Carlton, and thank you for inviting me.
It's an absolute pleasure of mine, actually. So it's great to have you on. I'd just like for you to outline to the listeners what your latest book is about, and maybe then go back to some of your other books, which is all around the same sort of era and the same thing, and explain why you found this period of time quite interesting.
Sure. Actually, I have a BA in history, and I've had a lifelong interest in First World War espionage and covert operations of the early 20th century. I've written 4 books on covert operations of the early 20th century. Everything from a book called The League, which is about the American Protective League, which was a kind of a private detective force under the direction of the Justice Department during World War I, to a book called The Estrada Plot, which is about an exiled Mexican general named Enrique Estrada. He was exiled to California in the 1920s, who formed a secret army and was going to invade Mexico from the United States and overthrow the Mexican government. My current book, Agent of the Iron Cross, The Race to Capture Saboteur Assassin Lothar Witzke During World War I, is probably the most incredible of the stories that I've written. It's just, I mean, sometimes you read it and you just can't believe that these things happened. And basically what it's about is, during World War I, the Germans wanted to send an agent into the United States in 1918 to launch a terror campaign against the United States. And it was kind of an outgrowth of the situation that Germany was in January of 1918. Very difficult circumstances for them. The war had been going on for 3.5 years. The population was war weary. People were starving because of the British naval blockade, and Germany was sort of on the verge of social collapse. But Germany had just settled an armistice with the Soviet Union. When Vladimir Lenin took power in Russia in 1918, he wanted to bring the war to an end, and they concluded an armistice in December 1918. And of course, they would later conclude the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But this freed 46 German divisions for the Western Front, where they had been less powerful against the British and the French armies. So they had been fighting on three fronts, if you include their support for Austria-Hungary and Italy, the Eastern Front, the Western Front, and in Italy. Now they had a very strong advantage in terms of manpower on the Western Front. But this would only, they felt this would only be brought to a successful conclusion if they could beat the French and the British armies before the United States arrived on the Western Front in strength. We had started moving troops to Europe in 1917, but the vast bulk of the American armies had not arrived yet. So the German High Command and the German Foreign Office, German intelligence looked at this and said, we've got to stop the United States from shipping more troops over. And the way to do this would be to create some kind of incident on the Mexican border that would distract the attention of the United States from Europe and focus on our own southern border. They felt this would, the vast majority of the divisions going over, some of them would be bled off to protect the Mexican border. And part of their reason for thinking this way was what had happened in March of 1916, when, for reasons which are still unclear, Pancho Villa, with remnants of his Army of the North, attacked Columbus, New Mexico, with a force of about 400 to 500 men. And in Columbus, the U.S. 13th Cavalry was stationed, and they drove the attack off on that night in early March, and they actually pursued Pancho Villa back into Mexico. As a result of that, the United States sent a punitive force into Mexico of 6,600 men that later grew to 10,000 men, and we moved the entire United States National Guard to the Mexican border, just because of this one nighttime attack by Pancho Villa, in which, unfortunately, the numbers aren't exact, but somewhere between 8 and 19 Americans were killed. So the Germans are looking at this and they're saying, this is what we need. We need some kind of a disturbance like this. So in late 1917, the Germans start establishing covert training camps in Mexico. One of the camps was established at a place called near a place called El Claro, where they had 800 to 1,500 Mexican reservists and German reservists and Mexican conscripts training. They had several other small camps where they were training people for this theoretical invasion of the United States. And again, it isn't an invasion in the ordinary sense. They were trying to create a disturbance. They would be trying to create a disturbance.
Yeah, but also, as I understand it, I mean, this is superb, and as I said at the start of the show, not many people will have ever heard of this. They may well have heard about the letter which was produced that said that Mexico was going to invade the United States, which I think we got hold of in the UK, and we pushed that out as propaganda, albeit that it wasn't propaganda, it was potentially real. And obviously that played into the incident that you've spoken about. But in addition to that, what I would say is, I think that the fact that Mexico had lost those southern areas to the United States not that long before, in reality, if you look at the span of history, you can see why some people might think there's still support for us up there in California, in Arizona, in those areas where, Mexican people, if you will, for want of a better word, Spanish speakers, had been for many, many years, hundreds of years, and maybe they believe that something could come of these actions. Is that something that might be read truly, or how do you see that?
No, that is true, and I'm sure that the Mexicans, in terms of the Zimmerman telegram, They would love to get the territories back. The issue was at this point was that President Carranza had only recently taken power in Mexico after the Mexican Revolution, and he wasn't really that stable, that totally in control. So he was kind of walking a tightrope between the Germans in Mexico, who he was very friendly with. There were 50 German officers serving in the Mexican army, and the Americans. He wants to favor the Germans and, the money that the Germans could potentially provide him and so forth, but he doesn't want to upset the United States, which might send further troops into Mexico. So I agree with what you're saying, but he was really on a tightrope of how to do, and that's part of the reason why this invasion never really took place, because it would have led to an incursion by the United States. But at the time that they were planning it, I mean, the Germans really thought that this was an alternative, that they could mount an attack against Mexico. And in advance of that, from Europe, from German naval intelligence, an order came out to send an agent into the United States to sort of pave the way, to create chaos and disorder. And that person would end up being Lothar Witzke, who they send there. Lothar Witzke was a naval cadet in the German Navy, sort of the equivalent of a midshipman at Annapolis, and he had been aboard a cruiser called the Dresden that was sunk off Chile, and he was injured. His knee was injured, and he was put in a hospital, and he escaped to the United States, to San Francisco on a British steamer. And there he joins with a person named Kurt Janke, who had been doing sabotage and other sort of special tasks, special operations for the German embassy in San Francisco. And together they became what was called by Captain Henry Landau, a British spy master of the First World War, the most deadly sabotage team in history.
Yeah, absolutely successful.
Yeah, they helped to blow up the Black Tom munitions depot in New York Bay. It's believed that Witzke also blew up the Mare Island powder magazine, which was a huge explosion. And he destroyed the boilers on what had been the largest cargo ship in the world, the SS Minnesota, which had been about to provide supplies to Britain from the United States.
Yeah, Bill, can you just explain that? Because you spoke about the actions that they wanted to take in 1917, 1918, and as we know, on the Western Front, you had a stalemate, and the way the Germans were actually losing the war was because of the blockade, which they wished to try and take away by using the U-boat war. But the reality is that, as you say, once that they'd aided Stalin once it aided Lenin to come across from Switzerland to the Soviet Union, which was then in conflict with what they call the White Russians, the Russian Empire, and what would later become the Soviet Union, the communists, the Bolsheviki. Once that had happened, and German agents bought Lenin over, and Lenin was able then to have the October Revolution in 1917 and create the circumstance whereby first there's a provisional government and then later the Bolsheviks came in and took power. As you said, it freed up a massive amount of divisions which were fighting the Russians, then to be the Soviets. So the reality was that at that particular time, Germany could have had the upper hand. So the reason why originally they'd gone on sabotage in the United States, even before it was part of the war, was that the United States was sending all of the munitions to what we call the Allied powers, to Great Britain, France, etc., etc. Now, why was that? One could argue because of the money that was involved in that, but what you need to see is, and this is what I want you to talk a little bit about, is the other side of that. The other side of that, which was not Allied in orientation, but was more Axis in orientation. Because when I lived in Germany, I lived there for many years as a youth. When I lived there, we were always told, in Germany this is, that the vote to speak English in the United States was won by one vote over the vote to speak German. because 40% of people in the United States were German heritage. Right? Now, there was a lot of people in the First World War that did not want to fight against Germany. Can you actually look at that aspect for us?
Sure. Actually, there were a tremendous number of German Americans in the United States during World War I. There were about 8 million German Americans. And during the neutrality period, before America got into the war in April 1917, we were neutral. And we said that, we would be happily have commerce with Great Britain, with Germany and the Axis powers. If we received orders for munitions at the American plants, we would send them to the Germans. But the problem was the British naval blockade ensured that although we'd be willing to supply either power, only the munitions that went to the Entente went through, only the munitions for France.
Sorry, Bill, I know I'm jumping in because I just want to make that clear.
Sure.
Is that true, Bill, that the United States, would have been willing to provide either power base? Is that true? Or was that something that was suggested because of neutrality, but in reality, actually, you're already curved towards the United Kingdom? Because I know my father was in the Merchant Navy during the Second World War, and you didn't enter till 1941, till obviously December 7th, 1941. But he was saying to me, because he was there from 1939, he was saying to me that you were escorting ships as far as Iceland in 39-40. So the question is, were you saying to your public we're even-handed, but in reality, the politic was already running one way? And so we'll go back to the First World War. Was the politic running towards Great Britain, etc., rather than to Germany? That's my question.
I think the early on in the war, the politic really was neutral. And Woodrow Wilson had some problems with the British government, I think, early in the war. He was upset about the impact on U.S. shipping, of British stopping U.S. shipping and searching it going over.
Interesting.
But as the war went on, with the sinking of the Lusitania, with other things that happened, and finally of course, the announcement of continuation of submarine warfare, mm-hmm. and the Zimmermann telegram, we were totally pushed over on the German side. But it sort of began, I would say, like in 1914, early 1915, as they were trying to be neutral. But as the war went on, it started leaning much more in British favor.
Right. So that brings me to the Zimmermann telegram.
Sure.
Was it real? Or was it a superb intelligence operation by my old firm? Which is Secret Intelligence Service, MI6.
Yeah. No, I think it was real, because after it had been revealed, the Germans admitted that they had sent the telegram. So I really believe it was real. It was very clever the way that it was handled by Reginald Hall, the leader of naval intelligence in England. They had intercepted this because they were intercepting some of the cable. There were still a few land cable lines from neutral countries going through Britain. Mm-hmm. There were also, of course, radio traffic that they were intercepting and doing a fantastic job of breaking the codes. But they realized that that this cable would have this particular note, the Zimmermann telegram, was political dynamite. But they were sort of they couldn't decide whether, if they did reveal it, it would let the Germans know that they had been breaking their codes and reading all the messages. Mm-hmm. So they they arranged to get a copy of the Zimmermann note from Mexico City, so that it was the original Zimmermann telegram was sent from Zimmermann to the German embassy in Washington, to von Bernstorff, for delivery to von Eckart, the consul general in Mexico City, and he was to relay the information to Carranza. So they stole a copy of the telegram as it had been received in Mexico, and they dummied up the headings and things like that to make it look like it had actually come from Mexico, mm-hmm. Or in the process of being sent to Mexico, so it wouldn't look like it had been intercepted as a cable. So this confused the German, and the Germans believed that it had been stolen in Mexico City. And it leads to one of the tasks given to Lothar-Witzke in this operation is to kill an American intelligence agent named Byron Butcher, who the Germans believed was responsible for stealing the Zimmerman telegram in Mexico City.
And that's the beauty of the book, because you go into great depth. I just wanted to get this out from you, because I've read the book and it's superb. And you go into that depth. You explain that Lothar Witzke actually still believed that it was Butcher that had done it for Army intelligence. You actually explain also how Army intelligence took on functions that I would have thought would have been functions of, would it then have still been the Bureau of Investigation rather than the Federal Bureau of Investigation? They seem to be running that quasi like a martial law circumstance in terms of the Army intelligence doing a lot of internal work that you would have assumed should not have been the work of the Army, but should have been the work of the Federal Bureau, the Bureau of Investigation at that time. Can you just talk to that?
Sure, that's very true. There were a number of intelligence organizations operating within the United States during World War I, and you would have expected the Bureau of Investigation, which eventually became the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to be the ones investigating this. But their resources were relatively small, and that's why they actually helped to start this organization called the American Protective League, which grew to 250,000 kind of volunteer secret agents helping them in the United States. But military intelligence, Army military intelligence, took on a lot of the duties that would later be, of course, by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, mounting investigations of counter-espionage and so forth.
And I won't give anything away, but that does play into later on Witzke's opportunity, doesn't it? I won't go into that here, because I think people should read the book. Because the book is fantastic. The other issue, of course, is I would suggest that the United States has never been a stable state in terms of its access for all. Now, don't get me wrong, we've got massive class differentials in the United Kingdom and had at that period, and some will argue that suffrage, which basically all the way through the war was only under the Representation of the People's Act in the United Kingdom, was only given to a relatively small percentage of males who were property owners or had certain roles, etc., etc. So you could argue that there was a massive deficit of democracy in the United Kingdom. But I think what the case was in the UK is that for many, not all, they had been, let's argue, conditioned to their position and their role in life in terms of the class system. So thereby, the battle for revolution probably wasn't as great until, by the way, coming to the end of the Second War, and the losses was 800,000, 900,000 in the United Kingdom of soldiers. And then the question being, why have we fought this war if we don't have rights? So that's when suffrage was given to all males, and then subsequently to females, which a lot of females don't understand, that the first suffrage aspects in Great Britain of Mrs. Pankhurst, she wasn't looking for all female suffrage. She was looking for suffrage for females in line with males, i.e. people who were wealthy, who own their own property, etc., etc. But the question in the United States was, I think, it's such a disparate collective of people. I think at one stage you said all into one. You had the know-nothings, you had the American patriots, you had a whole host of different people who were claiming to be the only Americans, and then we don't even need to go into, but which is a major part of this ploy by the Germans, is the perspective of blacks in the United States who'd not that long ago come out of enslavement and effectively in Jim Crow laws were still back in enslavement after the radical reconstruction and first the presidential reconstruction and a radical reconstruction. So for me, you could see that it's quite easy to agitate within the United States to cause problems. So Can you speak to that, why that wasn't successful?
Sure. Well, actually, you're absolutely correct. One of the things that the Germans did, in addition to sabotage and things like that, were they were very smart in looking at the socio-political weaknesses of their enemies. They did that to countries in Europe.
Yeah.
They did it for example, in Ireland and in India.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
absolutely.
Also in the United States. And that becomes a very important part of this mission by Lothar Witzke to the United States. The Germans saw our socio-political weaknesses as being the racial unrest that was taking place in 1917 and in the labor unrest that was going on at that time. Some of the worst incidents of racial violence ever to occur in the United States occurred in 1917. Unfortunately, the East St. Louis, you could really call the East St. Louis massacre, where and again, these in terms of the racial violence that took place that year was actually more economically driven. In the northern cities of the United States, workers, because of the war, had been going off to join the American army. Some Italians had gone off to join the Italian army. And with increased war production, there was a labor shortage in the north. And a lot of the plants were recruiting Black Americans who were underpaid to come to the north and take positions that had formerly been occupied by white Americans. And this created kind of a real conflict for jobs, for housing, and so forth. So there was the ground had been set for kind of a racial conflagration, and all it took was a few sparks in some cities to set it off. Yeah. And unfortunately, these incidents occurred. The East St. Louis incident, 75, it's believed that they didn't keep very accurate numbers of people who were killed and wounded, but somewhere between 75 and 250 Black Americans were killed and 312 houses burned to the ground. In Chester, 7 were killed and hundreds were injured in Chester, Pennsylvania. So the Germans are looking at this and saying, wow, we can this racial unrest, we can use this to divide Americans. And one of the tasks that Witzke would have in going to the United States was to try to foment some kind of a racial uprising among Black Americans within the United States. And it was felt that this kind of a disturbance, again, would help drain troops away from the Western Front. In 1917, there was a union called a labor union called the Industrial Workers of the World, and they were at that time kind of a combination of labor union revolutionary movement, and they were against the war. And at the same time, during 1917, when the United States was at war, they were calling for strikes in defense plants. So the Attorney General at that time mounted a raid against, I think it was 48 IWW locals in the United States, and they arrested 165 of their leaders who were later tried under the Espionage Act for obstructing the war effort. So now there's a labor group that I believe the total number of members was somewhere around 100,000 that were sort of against the war and against the government. And they were also predisposed to sabotage. They were kind of a very uncompromising union at that time in terms of dealing with management. If management wouldn't give us what we want, we'll just smash their stuff. So having a disgruntled labor force that's predisposed to sabotage at that time, that was also seen as something that could be used by Witzke in mounting his operation.
And also, I think that was that raid that you spoke about. I think that was the first time that Hoover came to prominence, wasn't it, in organising that raid with the managers, actually, of many companies, because big business wasn't adverse to getting its own people in and strike breaking, was it?
That's right. Well, actually, a person named A. Bruce Bielowski was in charge of the Bureau of Investigation at that time. J. Edgar Hoover was in a smaller division of that. He hadn't really come to prominence yet. But
no,
there
I
were.
I thought he took over on the basis of that. I'm obviously wrong. Yeah.
No, that was later in the early 1920s. But there were some large mining companies and things like that took advantage of the opportunity to move labor members that they didn't like out of their plants. Yep. So the Witzke mission, which is what Agent of the Iron Cross really centers on, was to create from Mexico City. Lothar Witzke, this naval cadet who's now experienced with sabotage, he's been doing all sorts of other things for the Imperial Germans. He's going to leave Mexico City, go across Mexico to the west coast of Mexico, go north to the state of Sonora, and then cross the border into the United States. And his mission is to destroy American defense plants, to organize strikes in critical industries, to create this interracial insurrection that we talked about.
Within the army as well. Within the army.
That's right.
That's the
yes.
thing. Yeah.
And murder this U.S. Army intelligence officer, Byron Butcher, who they think has stolen the Zimmerman telegram. Mm-hmm. And it seems kind of crazy. One of the wilder things about this story that they would send one person or a few people north to do this, but the Germans had seen incredible success with just a few people doing things like blowing up the Black Tom munitions transfer station in New York Bay. I mean, just a few people did that, and it had a major disruption.
I've got to say, Bill, before I read that book of yours, and ladies and gentlemen, you should all read it if you've got any interest in secret intelligence and national security. I wasn't aware of the level of success they had, because in Great Britain they had very little success. The Special Branch and the security service MI5 did a great job, actually, of catching many of these people, with the exception, let's make that very clear, we're not blowing trumpets here, of the Winter Uprising. Yes, they got Roger Casement, but the uprising still happened in 1916 because the grievance was there. And again, in India, they weren't able to keep the Indian perspective suppressed. So within the empire, writ large, there were problems. But at home, actually, in Great Britain, the United Kingdom, so leaving Ireland out of it, in Great Britain, they were very successful in picking up on Germans, trying to do exactly the same that they were doing in the United States. And I wondered why that was the case. If you can touch on it a little bit later as you're talking.
Sure. Actually, well, I mean, MI5, I think, and Scotland Yard were just an incredible intelligence agencies and monitoring what was going on. And on top of that, you had people like Reginald Hall, who's intercepting communications mm-hmm. and giving them messages on the transfer of information between agents. In the United States, up until we joined the war in 1917, it was kind of wide open. There was no Federal Bureau of Investigation like we have today, with 15,000 special agents and the many things we have with Homeland Security. From 1914 to 1917, I think the Bureau of Investigation had maybe 200 agents for the entire United States, and they were doing there weren't a lot of crimes that they were federal crimes that they were investigating at that point. So it was kind of wide open for the Germans in the United States, and that's why I think so many more things happened in the U.S. There was no, at that time, really a centralized resource that was monitoring them. There were individual states, police that were investigating things. And in the case of some incidents in New York, the New York City bomb squad was able to investigate and
yeah, I found that very interesting, that the New York City bomb squad inspector was a primary individual within that, rather than, so I know in New York you had I think at the time you called it a political bureau or something like that. In New York police. So I was interested that it was the bomb squad guy who seemed to pick up on most of this. Yeah,
because I mean a lot of these things that were going on were being done with bombs and incendiaries, and when they captured things, like devices and things like that, it went to the bomb squad and became an investigation on their part. So yeah, they were one of the groups doing it.
Interesting. Yeah. No, I mean, I keep saying the book's great, but it is, because it opens up a massive insight. Can I just touch on on you, actually, Bill.
Sure.
What's your history? Why did you get involved? What is your interest? What sparked your interest in this field? Let me put it that way.
Well, one of the things that sparked my interest is, in the United States at least, in terms of espionage, much more happened during World War I. A lot of just fascinating, interesting things versus World War II, when the Federal Bureau of Investigation was fully organized and on top of things. I mean, in World War II, there were a few incidents early on of espionage, stealing things like the Norden bomb site and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
There were a couple of attempts by the Germans to land saboteurs by submarine in New York, in Maine, and they were quickly captured within a couple of weeks. But there wasn't really that much espionage activity that occurred in the United States. It was being very well monitored. During World War I, there was just so many things going on. Between the sabotage and political and propaganda, and it's just fascinating. I mean, to think that, we think of World War I kind of a very distant time where, what did they have for espionage? Was somebody wearing a false mustache or something? But no, they had
experts.
Very sophisticated things. They had, like, for sabotage, the German Section 3B of German Army intelligence developed like an incendiary device that was a little glass tube that you could actually fit within a pencil, and saboteurs could bring these pencils into defense plants, and they'd snap one end off of it, and some chemicals within it would mix and set off a ferocious fire. There are just so many things going on. The ways that they're transporting money to pay agents was very sophisticated, and it's just I just find it a fascinating period. And I originally started. I was so interested in it. I read everything I could find on it. I collected period books and so forth. And finally, I reached the point I started collecting original documents that had to do with espionage during World War I and photographs. And eventually I decided, why don't, maybe some of these stories are just so amazing. Why don't I try writing books? And that's what I started doing.
So were you ever in an intelligence or security agency, or in the military, or?
No, I have not.
No, you never went down that route. Okay,
nope.
No, it's just interesting how your interest was sparked by it. So yeah, so in the United States, would you say that people are cognizant of this time? Or is it just as much a mystery in the United States as it is here and elsewhere in the world about what happened in the US at that time?
I think, unfortunately, and that's one of the reasons why I've written these books, is that most people don't know about it. And if you probably spoke to the average person, who's not interested in history, they might have a hard time distinguishing even between World War I and World War II, what occurred. But it really is fascinating. And in the case of this Witzke mission, of course, he eventually, I won't give too much away, but the mission gets infiltrated by American Army military intelligence, and he is captured. And
don't give too much away, Bob. This is why I've been skirting around it. I've been coming to the point. So because it's a good book, you don't want to, when you're reading it, you want to be taken by it. So I wouldn't give too much away on that. Sure. But suffice to say that let's jump forward now. Let's jump to today. See, and I'd love your feel on what you see today, because I can see, let's face it, agencies, and your agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, is prima facie at this. Let's say they are skillful at doing what the Germans have been doing all over the world, right? Particularly in your, what you would call your backyard in the last 30 years, but all over the world. It's been involved in that sort of activity, because that's what secret intelligence agencies do. And so what I'm now seeing is, when I look at things like the conflict in the Ukraine, I don't know if you're familiar with the Maidan coup that there was there, etc., etc. You can see how that history that you've written is being writ large over there. You can see how the Mexican problem, as it used to be called in the United States, is now coming to the fore in another circumstance, which is now with individuals who are refugees or asylum seekers or whatever coming across that border. When states are then saying, as far as we're concerned, federal government, you should be doing this, but we'll do it as the state, and we're going to put barbed wire on our border. Texas is the one that comes to mind most notably. And you, federal government, are not stopping us because you are not doing your job. Now, in the past, you had the army, from what your books you're writing, oversee that process. Now you've got state apparatus, state National Guard, state troopers, putting barbed wire up, and then the federal government saying, no, that's now illegal. We want to take that barbed wire down. So federalized systems, federal border patrol, federal want to take away that. So that conflict I perceive as being very dangerous for your country. How do you perceive it?
Well, this is just my opinion, but I mean, yeah, the border and this sort of, you really can look at this book and see a lot of lessons from today. The importance for homeland security and what a few people, who are bad agents can do if they get into the country. But really, I mean, it is the federal government's job to protect our border. And I think the frustration is in Texas and other states that they're not doing a very good job of it. And that's why the states are trying to come in. It's kind of become a states' rights issue in this case. But I
believe 25 other states are supporting Texas.
Excuse me?
I believe 25 other states are supporting the state of Texas.
Yeah, we do have a situation here where the correct way of bringing immigrants into the country, of making sure that they are of good character and have good intentions is broken down, and there are millions of people that have crossed into the United States, and these people, I mean, a lot of times they can't support themselves, and they're being moved. They are moving and being moved to cities like Chicago and New York, Massachusetts, and other states. And I mean, when you have suddenly 40 or 50,000 people show up in your community, I mean, just imagine trying to feed and house that. It's just a major issue. So you're right. I'm sure there are many states that support Texas, and a lot of people who want better controls at the border.
So what would you see would or should be the lessons from the past to the present in terms of, number one, unity, because the unity of the United States, yeah, and secondly, in terms of processes and procedures to fairly allow individuals to migrate to the United States. What are you not doing right, is what I'm saying.
Well, I think you're absolutely correct. I think personally that the two big lessons of this incident are the need to ensure the civil rights of all Americans, that they remain protected. I mean, not just in support of the Constitution, but just in the interest of fairness and equality. And because, I mean, apart from anything else, as we've seen in this case of Lothar Witzke, social weaknesses are something that will be used by our enemies to divide Americans.
Absolutely.
And we're seeing this today with foreign governments manipulating social media. Countries like China, and they're doing trying to do the exact same thing that occurred at this time. I mean, another thing is, I mean, when you read about in the book about the different incidents that the Germans did in the war, it's a very small number of agents. The startling amount of destruction that can happen when only a few bad players arrive. So the importance of homeland security, and again, ensuring the good character of people coming into the United States.
Interesting. I mean, do you see a sense of the fact that maybe the United States should begin to, if you will, throw off the mantle, the self-given mantle, I should say, of being the world's policeman? Do you think, why would you have 800 bases, example? You mentioned China. I think China's got one base outside of China. I mean, somebody used to go there quite a lot. I could see that the biggest headache for the Chinese was to keep its nation of, I think, something like 300 or 400 different, what they call them, nationalities, peoples, together is for them, a massive situation, because the Han Chinese make up something like 84% or 83%, but of 1.5 billion people, the other percentage, 18%, is a massive number of people. So what they want to do is have harmony throughout. So they do concentrate much on their homeland, and it seems to be, to me, that the United States concentrates so much outside of its homeland, possibly to keep its number one role. But do you think you now need to reevaluate that?
I don't know. It's a very difficult question. I don't know. I know we have a lot of security alliances throughout the world, and it's important that we maintain those alliances and live up to our part of whatever bargain that we've done. But I really couldn't comment on.
Oh, okay. Okay, so it's not your field as such.
No.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, but brilliant. So, finally, you've been absolutely fantastic. Can you just tell me a little bit about the other 3 books which you've written about? I know they're not your latest, so you can probably give a little bit more than you can on your latest book. But I'd say again, for everybody who hasn't seen the latest, you must read it. But yeah, just go back to the 3 other books that you've written, just to give me a feel for them as well.
Okay, sure. My first book was called The League, which was the story of Americans who joined this organization that was called the American Protective League. And after World War I began, there was a fear that all of the German Americans, the actual, German immigrants who were living here, who were German, would somehow attack the United States from within. That we had would have a real problem with them. So very early after, actually even before we got into the war, a Chicago businessman named A.M. Briggs suggested to the Justice Department that he be allowed to form this private group of agents that would work for the Justice Department. And he was given approval, and the plan grew like wildfire. There were, at its peak, the American Protective League had 250,000 businessman volunteers who were acting as secret agents throughout the United States. And the idea was that they would monitor things in their communities to make sure that none of these suspected German Americans or Germans would be doing things. Now, the way it finally turned out was that a lot of these people that they were worried about were among the most, if you want to use the word, loyal Americans. Mm-hmm. They had left Germany because they had disagreements with the legal, they had political problems there. They had problems with the way that the economy was organized. They were kind of disenfranchised, and they were the most patriotic and loyal of Americans. But this organization had been established to watch them originally. They did stop some incidents from occurring with spies and espionage activity, but by 1918, the laws at that time had been so draconian that there was an amendment to the Espionage Act was passed, in which if anyone said anything against the flag, against the government, against the army, they could be sent to prison, and up to 10 years in prison, and I think a $10,000 fine. And so by 1918, this organization that had been started to, help protect against, spies and saboteurs had actually become a secret police throughout the United States, listening for what people were saying and what they were writing, to sort of keep people patriotic and in support of the war.
That was my point earlier on when I was saying about nigh on had martial law in the United States in that time.
Yeah. Now, actually, in truth, it sounds like a small number. It's actually a large number when you think about it. Probably only about 2,000 people were prosecuted as a result of, frankly, expressing their opinion. And the most famous, of course, was Eugene Debs, who was the socialist politician in the United States. I think in the 1912 election, he had gotten like 1 million votes, and he made a speech that was perceived to be against World War I, and he was arrested based on investigation by the American Protective League and went to prison.
So how many people were dragged underground because of that, do you reckon? And also, as I said before, if you had a German-American population of around about 40% at one stage, I mean, surely a lot of people with German heritage, 100, 200 years of heritage in the United States, with German names, which some of them anglicised subsequently, but would they not have felt, hang on, what's this about? This is against us. Yes, they weren't locked away like the Japanese were in the Second World War, which you could have argued the Germans could have been locked away and the Italians could have been locked away in the First World War, which they weren't. But we fear there's some racial aspect to that. But the point is that what does it do to you if you think you are a German who's still got your cousins or great uncles or great grandparents sat back in Germany? You've come two generations before, but it doesn't mean that all your connections are severed. You see what I mean?
Right. It was a very, again, there was like anti-German hysteria throughout World War I, and it was a very difficult time for the Germans in the United States. So that was my first book. My next book was called a book called Treacherous Passage, which is about a German plot to launch covert sea raiders from the Mexican port of Mazatlan to attack Allied shipping on the Pacific. It's kind of a sub-story from World War I. And my last book, as I mentioned before, is called, before the Agent of the Iron Cross, about the Witzke mission, is called the Estrada Plot. And it's about this general named Enrique Estrada, who at one point was one of the most powerful generals in Mexico. I think he commanded the largest land army that any Mexican general had ever commanded. And after a failed revolution in the early 1920s, he escaped from Mexico and went into exile in the United States. And at that time, he wanted to form a secret army, and it's just an amazing story where they recruited people from what was called the Imperial Valley, which is a farming area in California. They built armored cars, almost like little tanks that they were going to bring with them. They had airplanes built, I believe it was 4 or 6 aircraft built that were going to support their invasion force. And he was going to launch an invasion of Mexico and overthrow the Mexican government. And at the moment that this was going to take place, as they were moving towards the Mexican border, they were stopped. They had been infiltrated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, still the Bureau of Investigation at that time, and were arrested as they were heading for the border.
So this wasn't an American-supported attempt?
No.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, brilliant. So I'll leave people to read those books, and if it's anything like Agents of the Iron Cross, they're going to love it. Bill, we've had you now for some 50-odd minutes, and I know you've got to move on. So, listen, I thank you profusely for being a guest on the show. Excellent book. And for anybody who's interested in the world of secret intelligence, national security, and obviously the geopolitics, because what you'll see from the operation that you describe is the interconnecting aspects of intelligence and how it functions. And as I always say, nothing's in isolation. So it's how it all functions together. You get that in the book. So you haven't spoken about code breaking example, which is in the book. So, it's a fascinating read. So yeah, please do. Bill, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Carlton. It's really been a great experience being on the Black Spy podcast. Thanks very much.
Well, please do pass it to any of your colleagues and tell them to subscribe and listen to the show. And if they're interested in any way, shape or means in secret intelligence, national security, governmental personal protection operations or geopolitics, to come and listen to the show. Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, we will see you again next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.